Welcome to the beat. We begin with a warning from Barack Obama as we're coming on the air. The former president, who's actually known for his efforts to often avoid commenting constantly and having a daily battle with Donald Trump, is now speaking about what he refers to as the current government's autocratic tactics, the need to defend democracy, and the cost and risks that some elite Democrats may have to be willing to bear. So this is pretty interesting. Newsy. These are photos here, brand new from an appearance he just made. And we're going to play you some of that brand new Obama sound shortly. The context, of course, is the escalating power grabs, the abuses, the efforts by President Trump to normalize a different way of patrolling and policing and using force in America, and concurrently trying to grind down dissent. Even as dissent is hitting some of its highest levels in decades. You have to go back to the marches against the Iraq War to find anything like this. 5 million people across our country protesting in unity on one big overwhelming issue. It wasn't just against Trump's tariffs. It wasn't against a specific thing he said or did. It was no kings. It was the idea that unified all these people this weekend that there cannot be king-like powers in this country, not in the name of immigration enforcement, not in the name of some sort of muscular law and order union, that there has to be a line. Against that backdrop, Trump is continuing to press forward this week, activating another 2,000 National Guard troops to LA. They join the 2,100 servicemen and 700 Marines who are on the ground. And that is notable because this does not appear to be a fact-based or security-oriented decision, because there's mostly calm in the streets. The original incidents that this was supposed to patrol are now over a week and a half ago. The curfew has actually been lifted in the relatively small area, about 4 to 5 blocks around that federal building where the original protests unfolded. The governor, who's closer to these issues than the president, who's busy with foreign policy and 50 different states to think about, the governor says he objects that the troops are now twiddling their thumbs for Trump's political theater. And another part of the concern here is not just whether 4,000 troops, 4,000 people's service is sort of being wasted or misused. That's sort of the first order concern. The second is whether Trump is using what are still relatively small deployments in mostly peaceful areas today to try to build a precedent for a different level of force later, from the Guard, the Marines, to the way these ICE raids continue to unfold in dramatic fashion. And that's something Democrats pressed Trump's defense secretary about today.
How about if the president says he wants to send troops to 15 cities? Would you be willing to do that?
Senator, I don't accept your hypothetical because it's
That's hypothetical.
not a real
That's
one.
the question. You're the Secretary of Defense. Would you send troops to 15 cities? If the president said, do it, would you do it? 15 cities.
Again, Senator, it's a complete hypothetical lacking any context
Look,
at all.
You're the Secretary
And I refuse
of
to box
Defense.
myself in based on
Well, you can
questioning on a
refuse, but
hypothetical.
you're here asking for $1 trillion, and I want to know how you're going to spend it.
That's part of what oversight involves. You want this big Pentagon budget. Is it for protecting America abroad? Is it for dealing with what is still a very uncertain world out there? Or is it increasingly for Donald Trump's desire to put troops on the ground, more than 700? Fair question in oversight. He's under oath. Elizabeth Warren knows what she's doing. Senators know how to do these hearings and what they're going after when they conduct these questions. The lack of an answer is a tell, because even this former Fox News host, veteran, now very muscular, sort of aggressive Pentagon chief, doesn't want to say out loud under oath 15 cities would be fine. That certainly sounds like a king-like military patrol of our daily lives. So he doesn't want to say yes, hypothetical, but he maybe doesn't want to say no and risk upsetting his boss. So that's what you get there. But it's still a tell that there's an outer limit. Elizabeth Warren didn't ask about 1 or 2 cities. She asked about 15. And it's an outer limit they at least don't want to admit today. Trump, meanwhile, escalating the clash with California and their Democratic governor as we approach wildfire season.
Will your recent dust-ups with Governor Newsom impact additional wildfire relief out there? They've requested $40 billion.
Hatred is never a good thing in politics. When you don't like somebody, don't respect somebody, it's harder for that person to get money if you're on top.
That's the president's point there. He is arguing that there is a, quote, hatred coming from California and that then he might punish that. Of course, if you follow this story, it's pretty much been the opposite. California was doing its thing. Most states use local police and local law enforcement to patrol everything in their state. They very rarely ask to have the National Guard deployed. It does happen in big incidents, but California didn't start this particular clash, nor was there any evident hatred in the law enforcement aspect of it. Trump came in and for the first time in 60 years deployed the Guard without a governor's approval. Now he's saying, again, if you want to be as fair as possible, in response to a kind of leading question, maybe it'll affect other things. Taken together, though, you still have this concern about whether Trump is using partisanship and political squabbles in how he carries out his duties as the president of all Americans. New York Times notes the wider shift we've seen as images of handcuffed Democrats pile up in Trump's crackdown. We have elected officials who have been cuffed, who've been wrestled to the ground. And as I've told you, in individual incidents, you might say, well, that got out of control, or who knows what was in that particular agent's mind in a sudden moment, to be as fair as possible. The broader pattern, though, is of a targeting of the opposition party. And so Americans seeing this and the crackdown on the undocumented are finding new ways to object, to meet the moment. You may recall the neighborhood that mobilized to protect one restaurant when armed ICE agents descended on that San Diego street. People came in and basically said, we're not just going to be bystanders because we know the people who work there, because we know the business, because this whole thing seems somehow disproportionate. The community got pretty involved. Rachel Maddow reporting on that pushback.
And then, unsurprisingly, the whole neighborhood came out to say, what the heck are you doing? They set off multiple, what appeared to be these flashbang smoke grenades against the random neighbors in San Diego, against the people on the street who were outraged by what they had done.
Some of this is happening organically, just like if you go about living your life and you end up in a scenario where you have to do something or know that the act of not doing something is a choice. If you see an emergency or you're on a subway and there's a fight. But those things are usually pretty episodic. They're incidental, and you don't always really know what's happening when you come across that situation. But there, from what we can tell in San Diego, and certainly in Los Angeles, and in a bunch of other places, people are informed about the wider pattern because people have heard about and seen the level of these crackdowns and that they are targeting people just trying to go get a job or a day job or gig labor in LA or people working at a restaurant. In other words, not the gang members that were promised to be spotlighted and prioritized, but a lot of other regular folks who are, in a real sense, part of local communities, even if they are here under a less than legal scenario. Or, as we know from the economy, many of them might have been here legally at one point, a work visa or an asylum seeker, and now they are technically not legally here. They're undocumented. But a lot of folks are stepping up and saying, how do we deal with this knowing that history? And we're seeing civil disobedience as one of these measures. In Phoenix, protesters trying to protect those who followed to show up for immigration court proceedings, where, again, we're not talking about the brazenly lawless. We're talking about folks who are trying to follow the patchwork immigration policies of this country. In New York, Americans have used their bodies to try to stop immigration vehicles and staffers with them who go round folks up in New York. In Chicago, there was a woman sitting down alone in front of a van, basically putting her own body on the line to try to slow down, stop, or draw attention to what she sees as unjust government action. You can see that effort there. And to be clear, as a legal matter, when you step up and deliberately interfere with law enforcement, that's illegal. And that's true whether or not you agree with the overarching policy of an ICE crackdown. There is not a legal support for blatantly interfering with what police or federal agents are doing under the color of law. And yet there is a longer history of peacefully using that tool, knowing that it might be illegal in the moment, to make a broader point about what our laws should reflect rather than what they may reflect in the moment. There are many different ways to make that point. Here's D.L. Hughley on the idea.
Would these people have indicted Rosa Parks? She broke the law. She broke the law, but civil disobedience is why we're here. Civil disobedience is why we have some of the freedoms we have right now.
So that's on the table as well. And there's more than one way to think about it. And some of this is planned because you don't get 5 million people in the streets without a lot of planning going into that weekend protest. But some of it is clearly looks more organic or episodic, as I mentioned, people responding to what you see in the streets, what Rachel was talking about. And some of it might be a blend or a mix in between. Democrats have been experimenting with ways to meet this moment. Cory Booker did it through the power of the Senate and galvanized attention for a couple days instead of just waiting to react to Donald Trump. We know that the senator in California stepped up in an unusual way. Whether he knew he'd be cuffed or not, he was also trying to do more than just be a D.C. Democrat who writes a letter here or there or cuts a campaign ad. And that brings us to what I mentioned, a relatively rare set of remarks from President Obama, who tries to avoid weighing in every day because he knows that then you end up in an Obama-Trump debate every day. He's alluded to as much, and yet he is speaking here not only about the autocratic tactics, which he warned about from Donald Trump, but also what it means for stepping up. And he's calling out some of the kind of soft, rich Democratic elites who haven't always met this moment with courage and who might have sounded louder when the stakes were lower. So I want you to listen to Obama here. He talks about Trump's autocratic crackdowns and how they have endangered even elite institutions or top law firms where people who are there who might be very rich or millionaires kind of thought they were untouchable in a very day-to-day sense. And now they have to consider pushback and economic sanctions. Even if they're not dealing with the risk of someone throwing their body in front of an ICE raid, they still have to deal with it. And you can hear within Obama's very careful and respectful tone, which he's known for, his judgment about why it is time to step up.
You could be as progressive and socially conscious as you wanted, and you did not have to pay a price. You could still make a lot of money, have a house in the Hamptons, and still think of yourself as a progressive. And now things are a little different. We now have a situation in which all of us are going to be tested in some way. And we are going to have to then decide what our commitments are. You might lose some of your donors if you're a university. And if you're a law firm, your billings might drop a little bit, which means you cannot remodel that kitchen in your house in the Hamptons this summer.
He's talking to the donors, Maya Wiley and Molly Jong-Fast, on this exact question. And we're back in 90 seconds. People are stepping up in different ways. Barack Obama says if you're rich, you should at least be able to risk some money. And I want to bring in our special guest for this conversation. Maya Wiley is President and CEO of the Leadership Conference of Civil and Human Rights and a former New York City mayor candidate. And Molly Jong-Fast, Vanity Fair correspondent, author of How to Lose Your Mother, a Daughter's Memoir. I'm curious what you think, Maya, at something that is partly planned. As I mentioned, we had protests over the weekend. We've had different ways that in LA people want to speak back and protest ICE. But something that also seems over the last, I would say, 5 to 10 days, organically being more accepted that even elite Democrats, they used to say, oh, senators don't march, or you leave that to the base. A lot more direct action.
Well, if you think about the civil rights movement, part of that was because Black people weren't in a lot of positions of power, or they would have been marching. One of the things that's happened in this country is we have had more people run for office and win office who understand the value of using civil disobedience to advocate for change, to petition government. And that's what peaceful protest is. And not all peaceful protest, by the way, is civil disobedience. We should distinguish those two things. You can get a permit for a march or a rally. That is not civil disobedience.
Right.
That is just speaking out, and that is lawful. When we talk about civil disobedience, we're talking about the intentions of crossing a boundary on the law. And you had the clip rightly using Rosa Parks as an
Mhm.
example, unjust law or unjust behavior in some instances, like what we're seeing with ICE in Los Angeles and in other cities, and that is appropriate use, in my view, in the civil rights tradition of civil disobedience to say sometimes the laws need to be challenged.
Yep.
And there's a way to challenge them peacefully. What we're seeing with elected officials, though, is not civil disobedience. They're actually doing oversight.
Right.
They're actually saying, we are elected in these offices in order to ensure that others in government, public servants, are actually serving the public. That's our job. So when you see a Senator Padilla go to a press conference and ask a question and then get manhandled, that's actually appropriate oversight behavior. If you see a Representative MacIver in Newark, New Jersey, go and say, I want to inspect this facility because I have constituents in it, there's a law that says she can. So what we've seen break out is not about civil disobedience. It's about lawmakers actually doing their job and trying to find a way to do it in an administration that's not cooperating.
And some of it on paper can be more dissected than this environment. You have an environment where you have the president openly admitting to revenge, to targeting, to crackdowns. So then that seems to fuel how the agents respond. In fairness, I would say on paper that if you have a DHS press conference and you're not allowing questions from the opposition party without cuffing, without it escalating that way, there are people who are removed. And we've all been around. I've covered things in D.C. The Democrats might have the gavel at the hearing, and they might remove someone who's not called upon for a question. I think the big difference here is there isn't really a good faith baseline for how people are being treated. And that brings us to a cartoon I wanted to show you. I don't know if you've seen this yet. But when you talk about whether somebody interfered with law enforcement, you have Lady Justice's due process there, Maya. That's one point. But there's a second point. The claim she's assaulting an officer when she's blindfolded and seems peaceful has also come up because Lander, the Democrat yesterday, we have the video. And among the other claims from the local readout from the federal agents was, he was assaulting. No, he wasn't.
Well, that's called getting Black people treatment by law enforcement. And I say Brad Lander's a friend. It was appalling what happened to him, and he did the right thing as an elected official, using his job to try to provide some protection to people. When Brad Lander was saying was, do you have a warrant? That's what he was asking when he started getting rough treatment. And I think we have to understand, what role is this rough treatment? And it's violent behavior. What happened to Senator Padilla was what happened to Representative MacIver. What we saw happen to Brad Lander is when law enforcement decides they can be rough despite whether or not it is necessary, and that itself should be seen as a red line.
I think there's a real question if they're acting this way towards senators, towards members of Congress, towards the comptroller. What are they doing to people when no one's watching? Right? I mean, we see the way they're acting towards a United States senator. What are they doing when no one's watching? I would also add that I think these protests are so meaningful because you have people who really want oversight, right? You have voters who are enraged. And by the way, they're enraged at the right. They're also pretty mad at the left, right? They don't feel that they're the sort of, they're marching very peacefully, but they are doing that because they don't feel that their electeds are doing their jobs.
Yeah. I want to show you this other way that we're seeing this pushback, but also in the courts trying to figure it out, Maya, is a judge finding Florida's attorney general in contempt. This was for defying a court order. U.S. District Judge Williams writing that basically there was a series of implausible interpretations of language to argue he was complying with the order. Those interpretations were not believable. This itself is pretty rare. You usually don't have officers of the court going this far, and this seems to come from the Trump playbook.
Yeah, I think we should be very concerned with what we're seeing from the Trump playbook when it comes to our courts. To even how this administration is talking about judges or talking about court orders. And look, this is very clear. This is where we have a system of laws and they are supposed to apply to everyone, equally. And certainly people in power must be, in fact, take oaths to pledge allegiance, not just to this country, but to a constitution. That's a set of laws. So anytime you have any suggestion of either not telling the truth to a judge or ignoring a judge or actually verbally suggesting that anyone who is a court-appointed officer, which we've also seen in this administration, or a judge, is somehow doing something wrong by doing their job. So I think we have to be very concerned about that, because the message is, let me do what I want. Don't do your job.
I think that, it's hard to not see how the Supreme Court opened the door to this by saying that Trump was the king, right? By saying that, he had this broad immunity. And that decision has really set the tone for this administration and accountability. And I think you can see that they sort of see that they did this to themselves and to all of us.
Yeah. My thanks to both of you on the important, sort of really important topic here of how it all stitches together. So thank you. We have a new sound from President Obama, so we're going to play that for you, and the mass protests and how Democrats can actually break through what was once seen as the MAGA broadcasting platforms.
I want you to have good public transit to get to where you're going. And then when you get to that job, I want you to be paid well. And if you're about to have a kid, I want you to know that you're going to have parental leave when you have that kid. And if you don't want to have a kid, I want you to have the right to choose whether to have a kid.
The current opposition to Donald Trump, his governance, his movement, is large and clearly broad. 5 million people taking hours to be out in the streets this weekend. And yet liberals and Democrats are still lagging in getting that message out. Millions believe in it, but who's hearing it? They're not getting it necessarily to younger people who we now know clearly get most of their information online, because Trump and MAGA voices dominate those spaces, those podcast and digital realms. And that just matters politically. TV news also plays a distinct role in our politics, particularly with day-to-day governance. We can tell you it is still where most elected officials in both parties will go first, day to day. And yet the new media of pods and streams and YouTube shows reach many millions who do not buy or watch cable news. And these top sort of digital stars already reach far more people than traditional TV. Joe Rogan, 20 million YouTube subscribers, 14 million Spotify listeners, others building those big audiences. Rogan's podcast often ties or beats the New York Times Daily Pod. And he has more subscribers than the Times with 12 million. Now, politicos may notice these pods when they have the political guests, but let's be clear, many started as more whimsical, fun, offbeat talk show hangouts with comics and creatives, just chatting about all kinds of topics. Politics comes up, but it's not the focus. And while Democratic leaders once viewed these so-called bro pods as a kind of risk, full of divisive and admittedly offensive takes sometimes, more Democrats are now wading into these new waters.
I went to Japan recently, and I got both of you guys gifts. This is a Palestinian movement in Japan.
Thank you.
Solidarity with Palestine. And this is a little train.
Oh, if the Democratic Party cannot win the votes of union workers, who are they for?
Okay. All right, let's take a deep breath. You ready?
Okay, I'm ready.
My son's a big fan of yours, Barron.
Really, Barron is?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
he
Barron.
just graduated high school, right?
That's right. He just did. He knows you very well. He said, Dad, he's big.
Wow.
Yeah, big one.
That's cool.
Fact check, true. That podcaster, comic Theo Vaughn, is big, and it tells you something that in an age gap from, about 19 years old to President pushing 80, that's where they overlap. Now, after Trump's election win, some Democrats talked about just building your own digital spaces from scratch. That's a separate kind of longer-term idea, but plowing into even the right-leaning digital spaces could have a much faster impact than trying to build something for years to catch up with them, especially if candidates use this as a chance to talk like non-politicians, to go mix it up. That's the lesson recommended by a reality TV pioneer and Trump critic, Michael Hirschhorn. writing in the New York Times that the so-called broadcasters began as political novices, honing their kind of real talk style as touring comics and learning how to talk to people without talking down to them. Simple enough. And again, you might say, all right, Ari, but what do punchlines have to do with politics? Well, I'll tell you, Hirschhorn here makes a simple point. Skilled comics and politicians both know how to work a crowd, how to deal with where they are, not where you just think they should be. And the realness matters, especially right now. Authenticity is what fills the void when authority dies, he writes. So these mediums are new, but the core point is actually not new or controversial. You may recall the old saying, the medium is the message, McLuhan, or how people have talked about, and if you take a political science class, everyone will remind you how politics went through radio, and then it went through TV, and the Kennedy-Nixon debate, and all that stuff. The mediums of those times defined the political stars of those times. So nowadays, being, authentic and compelling in these casual, long-form conversations is different than how you would present in a Sunday public affairs show on TV. And it doesn't mean mimicking the hosts. It just means making the case on their turf, which is something a skilled politician is supposed to be able to do. Now, several of these so-called bro pods have a kind of breezy, anti-PC, anti-establishment attitude, including about what might pass for basic civility or sensitivity, especially depending on where you are in the country. But that, we should note, did not stop Pete Buttigieg from going in there as himself and really opening up, seeming to share more about his personal journey from the military to coming out.
Right around the time I came out, which is like a terrifying thing to do as a elected official in Indiana, right?
This was after you got back from Afghanistan.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. It was after
What happened? What did you eat out there?
No, honestly, what happened was, when you get deployed, they tell you to write a letter. And I still have it in a drawer somewhere. And it's the letter, it just says just in case on the outside.
Wow.
And it's everything from that you want your loved ones to know, from your internet passwords to how you feel your life went. I'm a grown-ass man in a position of responsibility. And I don't actually know what it's like to be in love. And if I get back, I'm not going to let that continue. Whatever the implications, I'd rather deal with that than once again contemplate the idea that I could go to my grave not knowing what it's like to be in love.
On TV, we're supposed to keep it moving, right? Jump to the next thing and the next thing. You see that there's a different vibe there. The medium is the message. If you're willing to catch up with that vibe on a sofa, a bunch of people around, less formal, and yet Pete Buttigieg did something that seems very real and important there, and it wasn't one of these Democratic lists of 8 points. Maybe he changed some minds. He certainly avoided the tone of a workplace sensitivity training, which plenty of people need, and everyone should be respected at work. But this is politics and culture and life, and he shared it in a very different way there. There's another classic line from a conservative culture warrior, the late Andrew Breitbart. It actually echoes an earlier point from the Democrat Pat Moynihan. Breitbart said, politics is downstream from the culture, which Hirschhorn notes. The idea is that people's stances about guns or feminism flow down from the culture they're steeped in, just as Moynihan from the left argued that liberals could use politics to reform culture and save society from its worst instincts. Well, today, culture now is politics, and these podcasters or broadcasters are the example of why, Hirschhorn writes. This media veteran and a veteran of the beat joins us next to discuss.
This is a good discussion.
Why are you shocked?
I'm shocked because there are a lot of answers stuff. You're asking questions that are not often asked.
Don't be shocked when you have a good podcast discussion. That was Bernie wading into the waters. We're joined by Michael Hirschhorn, who's really one of the most perfect guests you could ask for. He's a reality show producer and pioneer. He helped develop the lucrative concept of celebrity reality TV. He was head of programming at VH1. He's run his own shop. And while he and Donald Trump share the history of reality TV, you have been a writer and leader of the resistance against Trump for a long time. You've put a lot of your mind share into that. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
You write this New York Times piece. We explored some of the points. What stands out to you?
I think we're in an age when being a real person matters more than what your particular position is. And I think the Republican candidates have understood that they can use this podcast medium to really, lock in with their voters and get intimate and get trust with their voters. And it was really notable that Kamala refused to go on a lot of these podcasts. She went on a couple safer podcasts, but she missed this opportunity, which is how most voters under the age of 40 get their news and get their allegiances.
And it's continuing. We'll put this box we had back up because I want to show folks. When you look at this box, you got some people you might know. We just saw Schultz with Bernie Sanders lower left. Rogan's pretty known. But upper left is Theo Vaughn, a funny comic, not particularly right wing, with J.D. Vance recently. Republicans continue to engage this space, not just during election season.
That's right. And they understand that young people are not consuming traditional news. Young people are not reading the New York Times. They're not reading the Atlantic. And if they want to reach them and they want to continue to connect with them, this is how they have to do it.
You mentioned being authentic. Reality TV offers the promise of something more real than script. But as you've written, eventually everyone is unscripted performing, right?
Right. You're performing authenticity. And I wonder if podcasts are going to get to that point at some point. But right now, I think these remarkable moments, like the Pete Buttigieg clips that you showed earlier, they're deeply moving. And I think that there's the reason they're so moving is because there's so much distrust of politicians in general, right? And that's what these podcasters are saying. And there's a reason they like Bernie and they like Trump. It doesn't really make sense, except that they trust that Bernie is an authentic human being who's willing to stand by his issues, who's consistent, who's self-deprecating with sense of humor, those people on the margins are more authentic than your kind of traditional mealy-mouthed politician.
So let's turn to populism. It's a word that means like everything and nothing. But the idea that your leaders should genuinely care about what everyone's going through and try to reflect their experience, needs, and aspirations is a version of populism, yes?
For sure.
And these podcasters come at politics like a lot of people, not junkies, not assuming one side is the absolute monopoly truth, and then kind of BSing about it, right? Because it's not sacred to them, right? People who might not BS about a carburetor or something else they care about are like, no, there's an answer to that. But and that seems to offend liberal elites or Democratic Party leaders, whatever you want to call it, more than conservatives. Is that a fair observation? And then how do you address that?
Well, I think that's, absolutely right. I think the thing with Democrats is that they still are working out of an old paradigm.
Yep.
And that paradigm is not ideological. It's partly linguistic. It's the way people talk, the way politicians talk, carefully parsing their positions, thinking about all the different interest groups versus populists. And we see this time and again with Trump, who gets away with saying incredibly unpopular things. And there's the old New Yorker cartoon where, there's the wolf on the billboard and the sheep are saying, well, he tells it like it is. Like the Trump character's like, I'm going to eat you.
Yeah.
And so somehow we've moved into this paradigm where anything that's perceived as authentic is better than anything that's seen as explicitly political.
They say history rhymes or whatever. You go back far enough, and I'm sure some of our beat viewers will remember this or know their history. You got Adlai Stevenson and the Eggheads. You had the whole technocratic thing. You had the East Coast elite thing. How is it that the Democratic Party, which cared about labor and civil rights and the diverse future of America that could become something durable, ended up being caricatured as, but sometimes sounding like you're back to Adlai and the 50s eggheads who didn't connect with the country?
And then Gary Hart in the 80s, who very explicitly said that the Democrats should position themselves as technocratic, urban, aspirational, as opposed to pro-labor. Like Mondale was probably the last properly pro-labor candidate. The part I can't quite get is Biden was incredibly pro-labor, and you understood, I think, I'm not in a labor union, but I would imagine if you were in a labor union, you would understand that Biden cared about you.
Well, it helped him in 20 in the primary and the general.
Yes.
And then I don't know, because you're a Hollywood guy at the end of the day, so I don't know
how
closely you follow this, but there was a perception over time that he had just become too old for the job.
For sure.
I don't know if do you remember that?
I have a vague memory.
It was
of
a
that.
thing for a bit.
It was
so
like
then
Tuesday.
it didn't. The things that powered him in 20 were Biden as Biden, and he did something no other Democrat has done, which is he beat Trump in the Electoral College.
Right.
And you can't take that from him once. And then later it was Biden as old Biden. And you talk about these people watching online, that he was disqualified to them in a way that similarly elderly Trump was not.
That's right. And I think the Democrats wanted to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, euphemistically titled bill that did a lot of amazing things, and yet they were speaking about it in a way that was unable to break through.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a communication failure that precedes a policy failure. There's a way of talking that there's a certain way of talking that nobody talks that way anymore, which is largely the way Democrats talk. And there's a new mode of discourse that they have to embrace if they want to be heard, right? You don't have to go on these podcasts and be stupid.
No.
Like Buttigieg and Sanders were themselves. The questions actually rose to their level. They were smarter questions than they might have gotten asked in an editorial board meeting. They were more pertinent to people and gave them the opportunity to make their points, right? If you were on CNN, let's say, or on a Sunday morning show, someone would be trying to string you up about changing your position or policy on something or some gotcha language. They're trying to get a scoop. These guys aren't trying to do anything like that. They're trying to get at who you are as a person. And that's an incredible opportunity.
Yeah. And what you wrote and what you're saying today speaks to the other important point, which is having confidence in who you are and your ideas goes a long way. That means you can withstand jokes, attacks, even misinformation. If you go on Rogan, the way he is these days, there's going to be some back and forth. He's going to refer to things that aren't true, but you don't have to have your whole worldview astounded by that. You say, I get why you've heard that. Let's talk about it, right? Rather than we couldn't possibly engage with that. Well, everyone's got a phone full of misinformation. So we don't have the luxury of not engaging with that. So I thought you made some good points. As you know, I have a deadpan style. So what I said about Biden's age and you being strictly Hollywood were both sarcastic comments. Not
well, I
100%
appreciate
true.
the clarification, and your audience does as well.
Okay, good. Michael Hirschhorn joining us about his interesting Times piece that a lot of people were discussing. Quick break. When we come back, you will hear more from the new Obama remarks making waves. What does Barack Obama think about everything Donald Trump is doing and critics say getting away with right now? Well, he made these rare remarks. We're playing a new section that has not made air yet tonight. This is former President Obama warning with his careful style about something that others have said, that this is not normal politics right now or a normal clash with the California governor, that Donald Trump is normalizing a slide from democracy to autocracy.
Democracy is not self-executing. It requires people, judges, and people in the Justice Department, and people throughout the government who take an oath to uphold the Constitution. When that isn't happening, we start drifting into something that is not consistent with American democracy. It is consistent with autocracies. I think that we are dangerously close to normalizing behavior like that.
It's dangerous. We're close. And we're talking about the risk to democracy itself. And that's not the statement from a candidate who wants higher office. He's served his time. It's not from someone writing a book trying to get your attention. It is, best as we understand it, former President Obama's concerns about how close we are to the dangerous end of democracy right now. We'll be right back. Iran and Israel have been exchanging airstrikes, and there's a growing divide in the country of the United States about what should be done, including within MAGA. Here is former Fox News host Tucker Carlson confronting hawkish Senator Ted Cruz.
How many people live in Iran, by the way? I don't know the population. At all? No, I don't know the population. You don't know the population of the country you seek to topple? Well,
Why
because
is that
if you
relevant?
don't know anything about the country...
I didn't say I don't know anything about
Okay, what's the ethnic mix of Iran?
They are Persians and
What percent?
predominantly Shia. Okay, this is cute.
it's not
Okay.
even... You don't know anything about Iran. So
Okay,
actually,
I
the
am not
country-
the Tucker Carlson
No, but
expert on Iran.
You're a
who
senator
says-
who's calling
Okay,
for the
you're the one who
overthrow of the
claims-
government.
You're the
and
one
you
who
don't know
claims
anything about the country.
No, you don't know anything about the country.
It went on like that. You don't know. But it speaks to why this is still such a tense moment and concerns about whether people know enough before they start dropping more bombs. That does it for us.